You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we've officially got a flipped witness against Donald Trump. Can you speak on the latest news in the federal classified documents case?
Yeah, it's kind of a big deal because Donald Trump's former director of IT at Mar-a-Lago, gentleman named Yuscil Taveras, has flipped, cutting right to the chase. Really interesting the way it came about. So Taveras was represented by a lawyer from Trump world, a guy named Stanley Woodward, a guy who pretty clearly seemed to have Donald Trump's best interests at heart.
I mean, he was
Not
literally
his.
getting paid by Donald Trump's PAC.
Yeah, and we've seen this movie before, right? Remember when somebody from Trump world was representing Cassidy Hutchinson, and then once she got a legitimate lawyer and made a break with Trump world, the truth started tumbling out to the extreme detriment of Trump, Mark Meadows, and others. Well, here we go again. Mr. Taveras was represented by a Trump world lawyer. He went into the grand jury, Jack Smith's grand jury in Washington, D.C., and he lied. He lied to protect Trump. He lied to protect Trump's co-defendants, Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira. And then Jack Smith said, you know what? We think this guy has got a conflicted lawyer. We think this lawyer is protecting Donald Trump, not zealously representing his own client. And they petitioned Chief Judge Boasberg to get a conflict-free attorney appointed to Taveras, somebody who would legitimately represent Taveras' interest. The judge did that. And as soon as Mr. Taveras got a legitimate lawyer who was looking out for his best interests, he flipped. He said, you know what? I want to retract the lies that I told the grand jury, and I want to tell the truth about the scheme of Trump and Nauta and de Oliveira to delete video surveillance footage that had been subpoenaed by the grand jury. Talk about incriminating evidence and talk about powerful evidence of a cover-up. This spells real trouble for Trump and his co-defendants.
What's the difference here? Because in that indictment, and based on the grand jury testimony that he had first retracted and then given the truthful testimony for, what is the difference now? What is the news here in terms of an agreement that he's reached with Jack Smith that we haven't already seen based on what we read in the indictment, which is him basically just flipping on Trump then?
Yeah, well, in the indictment, I think Taveras said, he really didn't have any information about Trump and the other co-defendants trying to delete video surveillance footage concerning the classified documents. But now that he's gone into the grand jury and told the truth and basically given up Trump and the other co-defendants, he has saved himself. Why do I say that? When you go into a grand jury and you lie and you cover up the crimes of others, Taveras was facing a perjury charge for openers. He was facing an obstruction of justice charge because he's covering up the crimes of others and he's interfering with the grand jury investigation of those crimes. Let me tell you, Brian, perjury carries a 5-year hit, potentially. Obstruction of justice carries up to 20 years in prison. Taveras was potentially also looking at an accessory after the fact charge. What is that? Well, when you know that others have committed crimes and you lie to try to help them get out of those crimes, or your lies have the impact, the potential of helping them get away with those crimes, you could also be charged as an accessory after the fact. So Mr. Taveras, if he had stuck with his lies, he would have had a whole world of trouble coming to him. But you know what? He would have protected Trump and the other co-conspirators, co-defendants. So now Mr. Taveras is on the right side of the law. He's going to be on the right side of history. And it really does spell trouble for Trump and the other co-defendants.
Well, to that point, what impact will this testimony by Taveras have on Trump? Like, how much worse did Trump's chances in this trial just get as the result of this one witness's cooperation with the federal government?
Significantly worse, because not only does this provide more evidence of Donald Trump's crimes, his unlawful retention of classified information, his obstruction of justice, and his violation of our nation's espionage laws, but it also provides important evidence of consciousness of guilt. Because you know what? You don't need to delete security video footage of what was going on, in and around that storage room where those classified documents were being held. unless you know that you're guilty of some crime. You only cover something up if you know you could get in trouble. So, it's not only substantive evidence of criminal activity, it's powerful evidence of a guilty conscience, of criminal intent, of corrupt mens rea, state of mind. So it really is an incriminating twofer that the prosecutors are getting from the testimony of Mr. Taveras.
Well, Glenn, I mean, who among us hasn't deleted the security footage of an entire resort's worth of cameras? Uh,
It
Glenn,
was just a full storage issue on the server. They wanted to, clear up some
yeah,
memory.
yeah, that's all. Just making some room. Could Judge Cannon do anything to suppress this testimony by Taveras, or do anything to interfere in any way, given this new development?
Two different questions. I don't think the judge can do anything to suppress this testimony.
Okay.
I think she can interfere in the prosecution in Florida in lots of ways, large and small. I think primarily she can interfere on the scheduling front. She can keep pushing deadlines further and further down the road, which inevitably will have the effect of having to move the May trial date even further down the road. But here's the thing. Once Taveras got qualified, conflict-free counsel, once his Sixth Amendment right to counsel was honored, he began telling the truth. There is no legal basis to suppress any of that. Now, Mr. Taveras will be cross-examined mightily at trial, and Trump's lawyers will try to make it seem like he really told the truth the first time around when he said, I don't know nothing about nothing,
Yeah.
when he was represented by a conflicted lawyer from Trump world. But let me tell you, Brian, that dog ain't going to hunt in front of the jurors.
Now, Taveras has further implicated Walt Nauta and De Oliveira. Those were the other co-defendants in the classified documents case. Does this testimony now by Taveras make the case stronger against all of them and increase the pressure on those people to start cooperating? And do you expect to see that?
Yeah, it really does, because each co-conspirator is criminally responsible for each crime committed by other co-conspirators, whether the first co-conspirator participated in the crime or not. So I actually should have said it's not just an incriminating twofer, it's kind of an incriminating trifecta, because the other thing that this will almost inevitably do is it will ratchet up the pressure on Nauta and De Oliveira, and one of those two may be the next to flip as a result of Taveras giving it up.
And what is the benefit of flipping early versus just holding on as long as you can, and when it just seems inevitable that this thing is going downhill and that there's no defense here, no hope to prevail here, then you ultimately flip? Why do it sooner rather than later?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will tell you, different prosecutors have different schools of thought. Some people will approach these potential cooperators, right? People that we know did wrong, we know were part of a conspiracy, but it's early on in the investigation. We're just beginning to put witnesses in the grand jury. We might step to that kind of a person and say, look, the earlier you come on board, the earlier you cooperate, tell us about your own criminal conduct and tell us about the criminal conduct of others, the better deal you're going to get. Maybe you even get immunity. Maybe you get a sweetheart plea deal. Maybe you get a plea deal that carries only probation, no jail time. The earlier you come on board, the better. Why? Because it allows us to begin developing our investigation with information from an insider, from a member of the conspiracy. That is so important, particularly during the early stages of a grand jury investigation. So most prosecutors, and I think the prevailing wisdom is, the longer it takes for a potential cooperator to come on board, the less benefit he or she is going to get, because now the prosecution is working, they're building the investigation with other evidence, and the evidence that the cooperator might have to offer becomes a little bit less valuable and a little bit less important over time. Some people will say, some prosecutors will say, you know what? Once I indict you, all cooperation is off the table, and then you're going to trial. I never took that view, Brian, because I never wanted to lose sight of the importance of getting the biggest criminal fish, So I always said, look, a good cooperation agreement that comes in at any stage, whether early, whether just before somebody's indicted, whether after somebody's indicted. And here's the real outlier. I will even take somebody to trial, get them convicted, assuming there are separate trials to come against others, get them convicted. I'll step back to them and I'll say, you know what? You are now convicted. You're now facing 25 years in prison. How about you come on board and cooperate now? And then when I go to your sentencing hearing as the prosecutor, maybe I ask for 5 years or 8 years instead of 12 years or 15 years or 20 years. So there's never a bad time to bring somebody on board as a cooperator, as long as that person can help me build the case to the biggest criminal fish.
Right, and in that case, it's Donald Trump here. Glenn, I do want to ask one last question, and that is on this issue of sentencing. You had mentioned before that the goal here was to convince the jury in the classified documents case. Even if the jury does return a guilty verdict against Donald Trump, will it ultimately be up to Judge Cannon to sentence him, and what could that look like if she is in the bag for him?
You know, the judge would have to be so deep in the bag for Donald Trump that if she were to sentence him to a wildly inappropriate sentence, let's say he's convicted on all counts, he will be facing in excess of 30, 40, 50 years in prison. If she does something like give him probation or give him maybe 6 months in prison, that would be such a radical departure from what the federal sentencing guidelines provide as the appropriate sentence. Now, let me add that the federal sentencing guidelines are discretionary. They're not mandatory. So she wouldn't be violating the law if she went wildly below what the guidelines say is an appropriate sentence for the crimes of conviction. But it would raise so many red flags. It could potentially be appealed by the prosecutors. And she would have to be so willing to put her whole career on the line in giving him an obscenely sweetheart sentence that I think it very unlikely. I have a feeling, Brian, if he is convicted by a jury, she will impose what we would call is a heartland guidelines sentence, something that's probably right in the middle of the guidelines, which will result in Donald Trump going to prison for multiple years.
Okay, well, obviously, we'll stay on top of this as soon as we have any updates in this federal classified documents case or any of the other cases that we're watching right now. So if you're watching and you want to stay on top of this stuff, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.